Welcome to our deep dive into the Ashtavakra Gita.
Yeah,
You've sent us these fascinating excerpts, and we're so excited to unpack them with you.
absolutely.
We're talking about, an ancient Indian text, a dialogue between the sage Ashtavakra and King Janaka,
Mm.
and the core theme here,
Well,
self-realization.
yes, self-realization.
It's about understanding your true nature, that awareness that's beyond all the illusions of the world and the ego.
It's not just about, feeling good or improving yourself. It's about a radical shift in perspective. It's like imagine seeing the world as a reflection of your own awareness and understanding that you're not just a body or a mind, but something much, much vaster than that.
Right from the get-go, in Chapter 1, Ashtavakra gives Janaka these clear instructions on how to attain knowledge, detachment, and ultimately liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells him to, focus on qualities like forgiveness and truthfulness. What do you make of that?
It's like he's saying, hey, you're already perfect, but all this stuff you're holding on to, the grudges, the dishonesty, it's blocking you from seeing that.
Yeah.
It's about clearing away that mental clutter to reveal the clarity that's already there.
Yeah. It reminds me of decluttering your house. You get rid of all the junk and suddenly you can breathe again.
Exactly. And then Ashtavakra drops this bombshell on Janaka. He says, you are not earth, water, fire, or air, nor you empty space. Liberation is to know yourself as awareness alone, the witness of these.
Whoa. He's not messing around, is he?
No.
So he's saying we're not our bodies, we're not even our thoughts, but that awareness that's experiencing them,
Right.
it's kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about it this way. You're experiencing this deep dive right now, hearing our voices, processing the information. But there's something else present, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
A sense of awareness that's taking it all in. That's what Ashtavakra's pointing to, your true nature as the observer, not the observed.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. And then Ashtavakra goes on to say, abide in awareness with no illusion of person. You will be instantly free and at peace. You have no caste or duties. You are invisible, unattached, formless. You are the witness of all things. Be happy. So he's saying that liberation isn't some, far off goal, but it's like a realization of your true nature, like right here, right now.
That's the radical message at the heart of this text, and it can be quite liberating, actually. It's not about achieving something you lack, but recognizing what you already are.
Now, in Chapter 2, Janaka, having seemingly had this realization, starts to describe his experience with such joy and wonder, and he uses these incredible analogies.
Yeah.
What do you think he's trying to convey?
He's trying to explain something that's ultimately beyond words, so he uses these vivid images to kind of help us grasp the concept. He compares the self to water and everything else, thoughts, emotions, even the physical world as waves, foam, and bubbles arising from that water.
So it's like saying that everything is interconnected, arising from this single source, this pure awareness.
Exactly. He also compares it to threads woven together to form cloth, to the sweetness permeating sugarcane juice. He's trying to point to that underlying unity that connects everything.
And then he makes this striking statement. Not seeing self, the world is materialized. Seeing self, the world is vanished. A rope is not a snake, but can appear to be.
Right.
It's like waking up from a dream, realizing that everything you thought was real was just a projection of your mind.
Right, and what's so fascinating here is that he's not saying the world isn't real, but rather that its reality is dependent on our perception. When we see the self, the world doesn't disappear, but its hold on us loosens.
But then things take a turn. In Chapter 3, Ashtavakra starts challenging Janaka, questioning whether he's truly realized the self if he still desires wealth, experiences lust, and fears death. It's like he's saying, hey, if you're so enlightened, why are you still acting like a regular human being?
Well, it's a test. It gets to the heart of what it means to live in the world while recognizing its illusory nature.
Yeah.
It's easy to talk about detachment, but are we really free from our desires and fears?
This is where things get really interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable. Ashtavakra is challenging us here. If we truly know ourselves as this pure awareness, why are we still so caught up in wanting things, even fearing death? How can we live in the world without getting sucked into its drama?
He's not letting Janaka off easy. He points out these inconsistencies, using the word strange repeatedly. He's highlighting this paradox that even after having these profound insights, we can still get caught up in these old patterns.
So is he saying it's impossible to live in the world and be truly detached?
Well, that's the question Janaka grapples with in Chapter 4. He defends himself, saying that knowing the self doesn't mean withdrawing from life, but rather living it with a deeper understanding.
So it's not about escaping the world, but transforming your relationship to it.
Precisely. And this is where the text goes beyond, simple renunciation. It's about finding that balance between being in the world, but not of it, living with detachment and wisdom.
And that's a challenge for all of us, isn't it? How do we find that sweet spot between engaging with the world and not getting lost in its illusions?
It's a lifelong journey.
Yeah.
And it's one that the Ashtavakra Gita can guide us on. As you move through the text, you'll see these themes popping up again and again. Letting go of the ego, finding stillness in the midst of chaos, recognizing that true happiness isn't about getting what you want, but about realizing who you already are. Ashtavakra gives us practical advice, too, like how to deal with difficult emotions and how to navigate the world without losing your inner peace.
So it's not just a theoretical text, but a practical guide to living a more awakened life.
Exactly. And it's a conversation that's as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago.
Now, before we move on to the deeper teachings in the later chapters, I'm curious what's resonating with you so far. What questions are bubbling up for you?
For me, it's this idea that freedom isn't something we attain in the future, but something we can access right now by shifting our perception.
Yeah.
That's pretty powerful.
I'm with you on that. It's both exciting and a little daunting to think that we have this potential within us. But how do we tap into it? That's what we'll explore as we continue our deep dive into the Ashtavakra Gita.
As we dive deeper into this idea of accessing freedom by shifting our perception, I'm reminded of something Ashtavakra says in chapter 8. He talks about how our desires and aversions, our constant need to control and manipulate experience, it's what keeps us trapped.
Oh, right. He makes this powerful comparison saying to be free of desire is to be like someone who, having been bitten by a poisonous snake, is no longer afraid of it.
Think about that for a second.
Yeah.
When we're consumed by cravings and anxieties, it's like we're constantly being bitten by these venomous thoughts and emotions. But when we recognize their true nature, they lose their power over us.
So it's not about suppressing desires, but rather about understanding their root, seeing how they arise and pass away like waves in the ocean of awareness.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're not our desires, just as we're not our thoughts or emotions. We're that spacious awareness that witnesses them all.
And how do we cultivate that kind of awareness? Because it's easy to say let go of desire, but much harder to actually do it.
Well, Ashtavakra gives us some practical guidance in chapter 9.
Okay.
He uses this beautiful example of a neem tree. He says, just as a neem tree's foliage wouldn't appeal to an elephant who loves salaki leaves, so too do sensory objects not attract someone who delights in the self.
So it's like when you discover a new passion. Those old hobbies that used to consume you suddenly lose their appeal. You found something more fulfilling, more nourishing.
Precisely. And that's what happens when we realize our true nature as this pure awareness. The fleeting pleasures of the world just don't hold the same allure anymore.
And what happens then? How do we experience the world when we're no longer driven by these cravings and anxieties?
Well, Janaka gives us a glimpse of that in chapter 12.
Okay.
He describes this state of stillness, this inner peace that arises when we let go of the need to control. He says, neither sounds nor other sense perceptions attract my attention. Even the self is unperceived. The mind is free, undistracted, one-pointed. And here I am.
It sounds so peaceful, so liberating. But I have to admit, I struggle with this idea of stillness. My mind is always racing, always planning, always worrying.
It's a common experience, especially in our fast-paced world. But what's interesting here is that Janaka doesn't achieve this stillness through intense effort or control. He simply recognizes that effort itself arises from a mistaken belief in separation, that we're somehow separate from this peace that we're seeking.
So it's like when you're trying to force yourself to fall asleep, the more you try, the more awake you become.
Exactly. True stillness arises naturally when we let go of the need to control and simply observe. It's about surrendering to what is rather than fighting against it.
And that's reflected in chapter 13 when Janaka describes his newfound happiness. He says, realizing that nothing is done. I do what comes and I'm happy. It's such a simple statement, but it's so profound.
There's this beautiful sense of acceptance. In his words, he's no longer trying to manipulate outcomes, to force things to go his way. He's simply allowing life to unfold as it will. And in that acceptance, he finds true happiness.
And it's not a happiness that's dependent on external circumstances, right? He's content whether he's standing, walking, sitting, or sleeping.
Yes, it's a happiness that arises from within, from knowing the self. It's not about getting what you want, but about realizing that you already have everything you need.
Now, I know some people might hear this and think, well, that sounds kind of passive. Does this mean we just sit around and do nothing, just let life happen to us?
That's a great question, and one that Ashtavakra addresses directly in chapter 14. Janaka describes how he continues to live in the world, but his inner state has been transformed. He compares himself to someone who appears to be asleep but is actually awake because his interest in the world has been exhausted and his mind has been emptied.
So it's like he's still participating in life, but he's no longer attached to outcomes, to winning or losing. He's simply present to what is without judgment or resistance.
Exactly. He's living in the world, but not of it. He's acting without attachment to the fruits of his actions.
And how do we do that? How do we live in the world without getting caught up in its dramas, its constant demands and distractions?
Well, that's where Ashtavakra's teachings on detachment become so crucial. He emphasizes that it's not about physically withdrawing from the world, but rather about letting go of the internal clinging that creates suffering.
So it's about recognizing those subtle attachments, those unconscious beliefs and desires that drive our actions and gently releasing them.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a sense of inner spaciousness, of non-attachment, so that we can move through the world with more ease and freedom.
And in chapter 15, Ashtavakra gives this powerful reminder of who we truly are. He says, "You are not the body. You do not have a body. You neither do nor enjoy. You are awareness, only the timeless witness. You are free. Go in happiness."
It's like he's shaking us awake, saying, remember who you are. You're not this limited, separate self that you've identified with. You're this boundless awareness that's experiencing it all.
And that's where the freedom comes from. Right when we recognize that our true nature is this pure awareness, we're no longer bound by the limitations of the ego, the constant striving and seeking.
Exactly. We're free to experience life fully, to embrace all that it has to offer without getting caught in the trap of attachment and aversion.
But it's not always easy, is it? Even when we intellectually understand these concepts, there's still this part of us that wants to cling, that wants to control, that wants to define ourselves through our experiences.
Absolutely. Ashtavakra acknowledges this in chapter 16. He says, "You can recite and discuss scripture all you want, but until you drop everything, you will never know truth." He's not sugarcoating the difficulty of this path.
So it's not enough to just read about it or talk about it. We have to actually live, embody it, put these teachings into practice in our everyday lives.
Right, and that takes courage. It takes honesty. It takes a willingness to face those parts of ourselves that we might rather avoid.
But he also offers us hope. He says that a right mind can become unshackled upon hearing this one instruction. So it's like he's saying that even if we've been struggling for years, there's still this potential for sudden awakening, a moment of grace, where everything clicks into place.
It's a reminder that this path is available to all of us, regardless of our past experiences or current struggles.
And that's what makes the Ashtavakra Gita so powerful. It's not just a philosophical treatise, but a practical guide to living a more awakened life, a life filled with freedom, peace, and joy.
And what's so remarkable is that it's all based on this one fundamental insight, the realization of our true nature as pure awareness.
Now we're getting close to the end of the text, and things get even more mind-blowing. We start to delve into some really profound concepts about the nature of reality and the dissolution of the ego.
We're going to be exploring some pretty radical territory, but I think it's where the real magic of the Ashtavakra Gita lies.
I'm ready to dive in. Are you? Okay, so we're back.
We're back.
And ready to explore the final chapters of the Ashtavakra Gita, where things get like really, really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the nature of reality itself and the dissolution of the ego.
Right.
No big deal.
No big deal at all, just the fundamental questions of existence. But seriously, these chapters, they offer a glimpse into the truly transformative power of self-realization.
Yeah, well, in chapter 17, Ashtavakra describes the true knower, someone who has realized the self. And it's not just like an intellectual understanding, but it's a complete shift in how they experience the world.
He uses this image of a neem tree again, saying that just like an elephant who loves salaki leaves wouldn't be interested in the bitter neem leaves, someone who delights in the self is no longer drawn to those fleeting pleasures of the senses.
It's like those desires, they just don't have the same pull anymore because you've tapped into something much deeper, much more fulfilling.
Exactly. And it's not about denying or suppressing those desires. It's about recognizing their true nature, seeing them arise and pass away like clouds in the vast sky of awareness.
Yeah, how does this true knower navigate the world? Do they just become hermits, completely detached from everything?
Not necessarily. Ashtavakra describes how the true knower still engages with the world, but their actions are no longer driven by personal desires or anxieties.
Mhm.
They act with a sense of ease and spontaneity without attachment to outcomes.
It's like they're flowing with the current of life rather than trying to swim upstream against it.
Exactly. And in verse 17.7, he says, "The man of knowledge neither cares for the universe nor desires its dissolution. He lives happily on whatever comes his way. He is blessed." There's a beautiful sense of equanimity in that statement, a deep acceptance of what is.
It reminds me of that saying, uh, grant me the serenity to accept the things I can, change the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
That's a perfect analogy. And this acceptance doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent. Ashtavakra emphasizes that the true knower still experiences the world fully, but they do so without getting caught in the trap of identification.
So it's about experiencing life with all its ups and downs, its joys and sorrows, but without letting those experiences define who you are.
That's it. They're present to the experience, but they're not attached to it.
And this non-attachment, this freedom from clinging, allows them to act spontaneously and effortlessly without the burden of self-consciousness or the need to control.
Right. It's like they're dancing with life, moving freely and gracefully without the rigidity of the ego.
Yeah, and this freedom extends to the realm of emotions, too. The true knower isn't tossed around by the waves of, happiness and sorrow, praise and blame.
They've transcended that duality. They see the interconnectedness of everything, recognizing that it's all just a dance of energy, a play of consciousness.
So it's about seeing the bigger picture, understanding that even difficult experiences have their place in the grand scheme of things.
And that brings us to one of the most profound and maybe mind-bending concepts in the Ashtavakra Gita, the idea of non-duality, the realization that there's ultimately only one reality.
Yeah, this is where things get really metaphysical, right?
Absolutely. In chapter 18, Ashtavakra uses a series of powerful statements to point to the illusory nature of the separate self. He says things like, the universe is but a thought in consciousness. In reality, it is nothing. And the self, which is absolute, effortless, timeless, immaculate, is without limits and at no distance from you. You are forever it.
Whoa, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So he's saying that everything we perceive as separate, including ourselves, is ultimately an illusion.
That's the essence of non-duality. It's the recognition that everything is interconnected, arising from this single source of consciousness. We're not separate from this consciousness. We are this consciousness.
It's kind of like realizing that the wave is not separate from the ocean. It's just a different expression of the same water.
That's a great way to put it. And this realization can be incredibly liberating because it frees us from the limitations of the ego, from the sense of separation and isolation that causes so much suffering.
But how do we even begin to grasp this concept, let alone experience? It seems so abstract, so far removed from our everyday lives.
It is a radical shift in perspective, and it can't be understood solely through intellect. It requires a direct experience, a deep dive into the heart of awareness.
And that's what the final chapters of the Ashtavakra Gita point to, isn't it? They're not just about intellectual understanding, but about a profound transformation of consciousness.
Exactly. In chapters 19 and 20, Janaka describes his experience of abiding in the self, and his words become increasingly poetic, almost mystical. He speaks in a series of questions pointing to the emptiness of all concepts, the ultimate dissolution of duality.
He asks, where is self? Where is not self? Where is good and evil, confusion and clarity? I abide in the glory of self. It's like he's transcending all categories, all limitations, merging into the vast expanse of pure awareness.
And in the final verse of the text, he simply says, "Nothing emanates from me. No more can be said." It's a powerful ending, leaving us with a sense of awe and wonder.
So where does this leave us? What does the Ashtavakra Gita offer to those of us who are still on this journey of self-discovery?
It offers a radical perspective on freedom, pointing to the realization of our true nature as the key to liberation. It challenges us to question everything we think we know about ourselves and the world, to let go of our clinging to the illusion of separation.
It's a path that requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to embrace the unknown.
But it's also a path that's filled with joy, peace, and a profound sense of connection to something far greater than ourselves.
Yeah, this deep dive has been quite a journey. We've explored some profound concepts, but hopefully this has given you a taste of the wisdom contained in the Ashtavakra Gita.
We encourage you to keep exploring, to keep questioning, to keep diving deeper into the mystery of your own being.
Who knows, you might just discover that the freedom and peace you've been seeking have been within you all along. Thanks for joining us on this deep